Welcome, everybody. My name is David Shankland, as Helene says, and I'm speaking from London, and welcome to you wherever you are in the world. Now, what I would like to do just before we start is just to stress one point that Helene made, which is the film festival. The RAI Film Festival, of course, is very well known, but it's particularly different this time because it has three distinct components. There is a face-to-face event in Bristol, which goes over 3 days. There is a virtual conference which concentrates on visual anthropology, and there is a whole film festival displayed virtually through a platform called Festival Scope, where there are 80 prize films to watch. All the details of this can be found at the in the RAI Film Festival pages, and I'm sure Hanim will put in the chat the link to that. But it will be wonderful to see as many people possible with us, so please feel free to do so. Now, it is equally a very great pleasure to welcome Professor Hannerz to speak with us today. Ulf is simply one of the senior anthropologists in the world who has made a fundamental contribution for decade after decade after decade. His list of honors is formidable, and his books equally so. And I should mention that amongst his many honors, he's an honorary member of our own institute, and we're very proud indeed that he is. So thank you very much for joining us. And we now turn to the consideration of his new book, which is available open access, so you can actually read it whilst he's talking if you wish to. I'm being interrupted by a little beast here. Now, what are you doing? Now, come on, you. Shush. Come on. I'm afraid we have an interloper who just burst into the room. So there we are. That's apologies for the squeaking there. So I think on that note, we should welcome Professor Hannerz to speak. And in the normal way, after an hour, we will turn to questions. But for now, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I am going to turn on my text, and when I get that on, I will only see my text, and while you will see me, and I hope this is going to operate well enough. Okay, so here we go. Okay, good to have such an audience of not least friends from various parts of the world here. I feel quite flattered that you came to hear me this afternoon. Now, anyway, you may wonder why an elderly Swede like me would come to do a book on writings about Nigeria. Part of the answer goes a long way back to the early 1960s. The Scandinavian countries had not played any very notable part in recent world history, but those were times of change. Our countries were opening up to the world, and young Scandinavians tended to be interested in the way a number of new African countries were gaining independence from whatever European colonialism they had been under. I was one of them, and this curiosity took me on a couple of journeys to West Africa, mostly to Nigeria, but also to Ghana, journeys basically of a backpacking nature. This led to my first book on Nigeria, Palaverland in Swedish in 1962. Looked like that. But this interest also took me into anthropology. I had certainly planned that my first real field study should take me back to Nigeria. By the time I was getting ready for the field, however, the southeastern part of the country had tried to secede, and the Biafra War resulted, drawing worldwide attention. This was not the time for fieldwork there, and I found myself instead for 2 years as a participant observer in an inner city black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Okay, I'm getting messages that have nothing to do with our meeting. Anyway, by the 1970s, it was time for me to return to Nigeria. I made my way to Kafanchan, a town that had grown up in the colonial period around a new railway junction in the middle of the country. Kafanchan is now a couple of hours drive from the Nigerian capital, Abuja, when the roads are serviceable. But when I was in the area, Abuja had not yet been built, so there were only savanna grasslands and a large cliff around there. I should actually thank one writer in the first generation of Nigerian novelists for the way it all turned out. On one of those early Nigeria trips of mine, the train I was on stood still for quite a while at the station in Kafanchan, with a lot of action around it, and the name stuck in my mind. Then soon after, I read the novel Blade Among the Boys by Onwora Nzeku, and the book really opens with a brief mini ethnography of Kafanchan. Nzeku was actually the son of a railway family, and so he spent his early life there. His sketch of town life appealed to me, so on a reconnaissance trip to decide where I would do my research, I went to Kafanchan first and found that I liked it. It was a comfortable field site. I could walk around most of it in a couple of hours. So I returned for several stays in the 1970s and 1980s. Gradually, I could develop my understanding of its internal diversity, as well as its external ties, its place in the world. By the 1980s, however, Nigeria was again experiencing more difficult times. Until the late 1990s, there was a series of military regimes, one worse than the other, ending up in sheer gangsterism. As a lone foreign ethnographer, I felt I would just be too vulnerable if I were to return to Kafanchan. And so my research engagement with Nigeria moved to a back burner while I went on to other things. Nonetheless, my interest in the country has remained undiminished. For one thing, I will be watching for the results of the presidential election, which will be held the day after tomorrow. But I've also kept reading its new fiction. The first generation of Nigerian fiction writers had begun to draw the attention of the outside world in those years around independence. Amos Tutuola, Chinua Achebe, Cyprian Ekwensi. Indeed, the first writer of Black Africa to win a Nobel Prize in Literature was also a Nigerian of that generation, Wole Soyinka. Now, Nigerian politics and economy have continued to have their ups and downs, but the country's literary production has been remarkably successful. You can go to a good bookstore just about anywhere in the world and look at the shelf for international fiction. There, early in the alphabetical order, you may find Achebe Chinua, and soon thereafter, Adichie Chimamanda Ngozi. Among the Adichie books, there would be a novel about the Biafra War, and Americana from 2013, about the contemporary life of transnational migrants. So there I was some years ago now, in the attic of my summer house. I was looking at shelves where my books and pamphlets and old magazines about Nigeria had accumulated over the years, in large part fiction, but some social commentary and other non-fiction as well. I should say the academic literature was really elsewhere. I wondered what I could do with it all, and thought it was a collection which probably would not make much sense to many people. And then it struck me that here were the materials for a book. Moreover, this could be an adventure in that branch of our discipline, which had been emerging in recent years as a literary anthropology. This has become a lively part of the discipline. It takes varied forms, turning ethnography into something less like conventional academic styles, more like creative nonfiction, or autoethnography, placing the anthropologist's own life story in a wider context, or reflexive fieldwork accounts portraying the personal experience of immersion in the field, and other kinds, but also the anthropological study of literature itself, as finished texts, as well as a kind of life and work set in its social context. Frequently, this involves drawing on field research in inspecting and commenting on literary work. So in Afropolitan Horizons, this is what I have attempted to do. The result is a memoir of one reader's encounters with writings, and occasionally and briefly with writers as well, not very respectful of the boundaries of established genres and disciplines. I'm in a continuous back and forth movement, zigzagging between texts and what I know in other ways, from personal experience and from field study. In fiction, you see the plot as embedded in ethnography. In my case, this is not a study of Kafanchan, but a set of essays where this town appears here and there as a point of departure for further commentary. On the one hand, I try in Afropolitan Horizons to offer a sense of the internal diversity of Nigeria. That diversity has much to do with the way Nigeria came into being as a country. The founding father of the country was really more of a stepfather. Frederick Lugard, a British military man in that period of late 19th, early 20th century colonialism, when European empires were competing with each other for territory in Africa. Lugard was successful in claiming a large area from the Atlantic coast and inland toward the north. And he eventually became Lord Lugard, first governor of a united colonial Nigeria. That very name, Nigeria, was invented by his wife, Flora Shaw, colonial correspondent of the Times of London. Excuse me. It was a huge territory with an almost entirely indigenous population, and it required a low-cost form of imperialism. Consequently, Lugard adopted the principle of indirect rule, which would mean identifying, sometimes inventing, native authorities and outsourcing local government to them, under the supervision of a quite sparsely distributed corps of district officers. This, for one thing, helped maintain into Nigerian independence a striking internal diversity. With regard to that diversity, Kafanchan was really a Nigeria in miniature. It was the site of a Muslim emirate, which had once arrived as conquerors, and which was actually politically strengthened by colonialism. But much of the town population were migrants from other parts of Nigeria. And then locals from the surrounding lands had begun to move in, Christianized by missions and opposed to the emirate. Then on the other hand, I tried to attend to Nigeria's transnational connections. This is where I get the term Afropolitan for the title of my book. It is an early 21st century term, probably mostly in use among literary scholars and historians. One central source was an essay named Bye Bye Babar by Thais Lassi, herself born in London with a Ghanaian father and a Nigerian mother, raised in Massachusetts and with university degrees from Yale and Oxford. The opening scene in her essay is from a London bar. The whole scene, writes Selassie, speaks of the cultural hybrid. These Afropolitans, either born in Africa or the children of African transnational migrants, she says, it belongs to no single geography, but feel at home in many. They are engaged in creating other Africas, Selassie says, and other connections between Africa and the world. Now, Selassie is mainly presentist and a bit elitist. But another central contributor to the commentary on Afropolitanism has been the historian Akil Mbembe, born in Cameroon, with an academic career taking him through the United States to South Africa. Mbembe has given greater historical and philosophical depth to the notion. That in a way matches my own understandings more closely. My own feeling is that Nigeria was already Afropolitan before it became Nigeria, a land connecting in important ways to more distant parts of the world. The transatlantic slave trade was already one part of this. Looking eastward, there has been the wish of Muslims in what became northern Nigeria to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Then came British colonialism and Christian missions, and in late colonialism and into the present, there have been the Nigerians moving out, temporarily or permanently, to other continents. It was in the nature of my Nigerian collection that it had a time depth, and also that it offers a network of perspectives toward the country. So although most of my chapters focus on Nigerian writers, I include the views of some other commentators as well. There is a prominent Brazilian writer, Antonio Olinto, who wrote a novel about an Afro-Brazilian family returning to West Africa out of slavery. There is J.M.G. Leclésio, a French Mauritian author who would earn a Nobel Prize in Literature and who wrote a novel about life in colonial Eastern Nigeria, drawing on his own childhood experience as a son of an expatriate doctor. And I have a chapter on those British veterans of the colonial service who, around the coming of Nigerian independence, wrote memoirs and other kinds of historical works on what was becoming an ex-colony. Reading back in time was also part of my field research in Kafanchan. I made occasional side trips to Kaduna, the larger regional center once founded by Frederick Lugard, to look at historical documentation available in the branch of the National Archives located there. The colonial period was then only a couple of decades away, and I could connect the reporting in the archives to the memories I was getting from old-timer townspeople. While in the archives too, I listed the names of the district officers who had written the reports. Fairly soon after, when I was spending a term as a visiting scholar at the University of Manchester, I got in touch with a couple of them by way of the government agency responsible for paying the pensions of the former colonial personnel, and I arranged to meet with them. They had both spent a few years each in Kafanchan in the 1950s. This had hardly been a prestige placing, so my two informants had been rather young when they got there. The old DEOs excused themselves at first, saying I could really not expect them to remember much. Since I had been recently in Kafanchan and knew their reporting, however, I could refresh their memories, and they were soon reminiscing about the local people they had written about, some of whom were among my own acquaintances. But both the old district officers really became most enthusiastic when they had a chance to reminisce about their own pet projects in and around Kafanchan. In the jobs they had now back in Britain, they hardly had the opportunities for their own initiatives and priorities they had had as district officers in charge of an area of tens of thousands of inhabitants, alone and happily far from their superiors. One of them had reported to Kaduna about how Kafanchan celebrated the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And then there were the annual festivities of Empire Day. In these small ways, perhaps, they had also been contributors to that border-crossing Afropolitan imagination. But let me get now to some of the pioneer generation of Nigerian writers to be published internationally, in London, of course. And then I will first tell you something about Amos Tutuola and his book, The Palm Wine Drinkard, from 1952. Tutuola had had rather little formal schooling. He came from a family of cocoa farmers, became at age 7 the servant of an Igbo man who, instead of paying him, put him in a Salvation Army primary school. He continued from there to an Anglican school, but left after altogether 6 years of education and trained as a blacksmith. Tutuola was of the Yoruba ethnic group, while that Igbo patron was of another of those major southern Nigerian groups who have been so important in Nigerian life, past and present. But Amos Tutuola had learned to write, and so he went on to explore what he could do with that. The Palm Wine Drinkard story, told in the first person singular, is a weird tale of encounters and events with people and unpeople. The drinkard starts out as a rather spoiled young man, presented with a plantation of 560,000 palm trees by his father, with an expert tapster to go with it. Indeed, he spends his days drinking, but there is enough for a great many people to start dropping by to share that liquid produce. Then disaster strikes. The father dies, and a little later that tapster falls down from a tree and dies too. There is no palm wine, and those thirsty friends drift away. So the drinkard embarks on a quest to find his tapster in the land of the dead to persuade him to come back. That becomes a very extended adventure. For a time, he works for a man who had lost his beautiful daughter. She had had a stall in the marketplace, but had been drawn to an extraordinarily attractive man, and had followed after him when the market closed for the day. But how surprised she was when she found that along the way he returned all his beautiful features, one by one, to their rightful owners, and paid rent for them. In the end, he had only his skull left, and went back to his frightening community where everybody was only a skull. The palm wine drinkard fights the skulls and liberates the girl, and so her father allows him to marry her. So continuing through the land of the dead, there are now the two of them. Eventually, they find the dead tapster, alive and well in this special territory, but they are told that there is no way he can come with them Once you're a denizen of the land of the dead, that is where you stay. The palm wine drinker and his new wife managed to get out, however. As they had never really died, they had just been in that land as visitors. As the Tutuola manuscript arrived in London, the response in local publishing circles had apparently been happy but also puzzled. And here we seem to find perhaps the first encounter between Nigerian literature and metropolitan anthropology. In consultations between editors and Africa experts, the advice of Daryl Ford was also sought, and it was favorable. Ford was a professor of anthropology at University College London and the director of the International Africa Institute. He had also done field research of his own in Nigeria. So the palm wine drinker was published in England, and there was an enthusiastic review in The Observer, the Sunday newspaper, by Dylan Thomas, and that probably contributed to its quick success. So I quote, "This is the brief, thronged, grisly, and bewitching story, or series of stories, written in young English by a West African." Now, young English was a nice euphemism. Indeed, Tutuola's language of writing was never exactly standard English. More highly educated Nigerian contemporaries, anxious not to deviate noticeably from correct form, were inclined to look down on Tutuola's somewhat creolized Yoruba English. They might also have been a bit anxious. Would such idiosyncrasy of style actually fuel a belief among an overseas readership that Africans were still only half-educated semi-literates? I met Amos Tutuola in 1961 in Ibadan, where he held a modest office job at the local radio station. We had an enjoyable conversation. He mentioned that his favorite book was one of Welsh ghost stories, and he continued to write. One could certainly wonder what kind of story the palm wine drinker was. No doubt, Tutuola could draw inspiration from Yoruba traditional storytelling, but he did so creatively. And then some 21st century readers would place his book in a fantasy genre. As it turned out, it would not be the last time the work of a Nigerian writer has crossed the borders of conventional genres. By 2017, we might note another anthropologist would comment at length on Tutuola's book. Now there was Francis Nyamjo's Drinking from the Cosmic Gourd, how Amos Tutuola can change our minds. Nyamjo is a Cameroonian anthropologist, now a professor at the University of Cape Town. In his book, Nyamjo brings a wide-ranging set of intellectual tools and baggage to his inquiry into the enduring meaning of Tutuola's work. Frantz Fanon, Pierre Bourdieu, and V.S. Naipaul are all there, as well as the best-known Nigerian authors. Not least, however, does Nyamjo emphasize some key concepts for an understanding of human life that can be drawn out of Tutuola's work, and that he feels may serve to revitalize contemporary worldviews and academic thoughts. Tutuola is the precursor of recent debates on flexible and fluid categories. There is conviviality, a term elsewhere put to somewhat different uses, but here referring to the basic fact that human life is relational rather than solitary or individual. The story of the palm wine drinker celebrates what it means to be a frontier being at the crossroads and junctions of multiple influences and potentialities. So perhaps we can sense that visiting the land of the dead, the palm wine drinker faces some of the intellectual challenges later facing Afropolitans as frontier beings. In the time of his poem Wine Drinkard, Amos Tutuola could certainly pick up his knowledge of Yoruba storytelling directly from his immediate social environment. But we could note that in 1974, the journal Africa offered an article on social anthropology in Nigeria during the colonial period, a retrospective account by J.I. Jones, former district officer turned anthropologist. This journal was the organ of the International Africa Institute, an organization launched by Frederick Lugard after he returned from Nigeria to Britain. J.I. Jones' article can still offer irritations, amusements, and insights, but one paragraph may now seem striking, and I'll quote it at some length. To the average Igbo villager, an anthropologist is someone who knows more about Igbo traditional culture than he does himself. Any monograph written by an anthropologist on a particular tribe and accessible to its literate members becomes a tribal Bible, the charter of its traditional history and culture. Today, it is the novelists and playwrights who describe the culture and institutions, and the historians who try to record the oral tradition. And it's in this field that anthropology has most to answer for, since the oral tradition of many of those southern Nigerian communities has completely absorbed and been corrupted by the myths of the anthropologists. And that's the end of the quote from Jones. One may suspect that Jones exaggerates a bit, yet his view could stimulate our curiosity about just how these later Afropolitan writers combine their understandings of indigenous Nigerian thought worlds, and how much of such understandings in their writings is importantly shaped by their own creativity. Did they learn about such matters at the dinner table from their usually well-educated parents, or in visits to home villages during the long holidays, or did they indeed read about them? Our curiosity here may be intensified by the fact that a number of recent writers of Nigerian background have moved on to something a bit like a magical realism, where transnational migrants of flesh and blood mingle with somewhat amorphous spirits. There is an interesting instance here in Chigozie Ogioma's novel, An Orchestra of Minorities from 2019, very well received by critics, with a central figure migrating from a small hometown setting in Nigerian Igbo land to Cyprus and then back. Remarkably, with that central figure's guardian spirit as narrator. Chigozie Ogioma himself is an Afropolitan of today's version, currently teaching creative writing at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He grew up in Nigeria, although not actually in the homelands of his ethnic group. In an author's note on sources at the end of his novel, Obioma acknowledges the early influence of his mother in discussing the Igbo spiritual world, and notes that he also drew on his father's and his own local field research in Igbo land and on several Nigerian written sources. But then he points out he could also use an early anthropological report on the Igbo, published in 1913 to 14 by the British anthropologist Northcote Thomas. And we can then learn from David Mill's book, Difficult Folk, from 2008, on the history of social anthropology, that the British colonial administration at the time regarded that same Thomas as a difficult and eccentric figure. As people inserting themselves in social space between the locals and the expatriate representatives of the empire, Something like that seems to have happened to some number of field-working anthropologists these days. Anyway, in the early generation of Nigerian fiction writers, Utwola was unusual in turning oral tradition into fantasy. His contemporaries were more realist in depictions of past and present. Things Fall Apart from 1958, Chinua Achebe's first book, portrays life among the Igbo people as it was just as the first white people showed up to colonize their land. It ends as the district commissioner reflects on what might go into the book he plans to write, the pacification of the primitive tribes of the lower Niger. Achebe's own book may still tend to be seen as a great African novel. It's been translated into 50 languages and sold in 20 million copies. I've used it myself in an introductory anthropology course to give undergraduates a sense of how a culture foreign to them would feel from the inside, and I know many anthropologists have used it the same way. Then other fiction pioneers placed their work in their mid-20th century present. Since Abuja came into being, Lagos is no longer Nigeria's national capital. But with its openness to the world, now with some 25 or 30 million inhabitants, a difficult yet oddly attractive place, there has been a continuous preoccupation with it in Nigerian writing. A pioneer in portraying Lagos life was Cyprian Ekwensi. By the time I met him briefly in Lagos in 1961, Ekwensi was Director of Information Services, an upper-level civil servant with his office in the center of Lagos, seated behind a large desk with a color print of the young Queen Elizabeth on the wall behind his back. This was on the brief period just after the arrival of independence, when she was still Nigerian head of state. The presidency, with an indigenous occupant, was created a couple of years later. When I met him, he had just published his second novel on Lagos life, Jagwanana. Jagwa is actually a nickname after the British luxury car. The woman in question is leading a very diverse life, in large part on the night shift, involved in one way or other in the fashion business, organized crime, and politics, by way of one male friend or other. What she really hopes is that a promising young man who lives in the same building will move on to England and study law, and then come back to marry her, so she will have a good life after she has stopped being so attractive to other men. So she supports this venture of his. But the young man is really more attracted to a younger woman, as becomes very clear when he returns from overseas. There are some deaths along the way, in crime as well as politics, and in the end, Jagwa leaves Lagos, starting a new life as a merchant princess in another city. Now I can imagine Cyprian Ekwensi rising from that desk with a portrait of Queen Elizabeth behind him and going home to write about Jagwanana. Beyond the preoccupation with Lagos, I try to give a sense of how other cities, such as Ibadan and Onitsha, became centers of writing in their own ways. Ibadan, Nigeria's first university city, drew on an educated elite for some time in the mid-20th century, coordinated by Uli Bayer, a German expatriate. Onitsha, more or less at the same time, was a major market city on the river Niger, which also produced cheap pamphlets on all kinds of topics. Somehow, these came to draw international attention among literary scholars. And then I have a couple of chapters dealing with writings about the Hausa people in the Muslim North, both with particular anthropological connections. The book Baba of Cairo of 1954 is a real non-fiction life history of a northern Nigerian woman born in the late 19th century who witnessed the arrival of the British colonialists and lived through 3 marriages. In a way, the author, Mary Smith, served as Baba's ghostwriter. This is the first-person narrative. The book was in part the outcome of the gender division of academic labor, as it was for much of the 20th century. Mary Smith was the spouse of M.G. Smith, whose successful but more conventional monographs about Northern Nigerian emirates brought him professorships at the University College London and Yale University. His wife, not in an academic career, but with him in the field, could afford to do a more original kind of writing. Then there is Ibrahim Tahir and his novel, The Last Imam of 1984, the tragic story of a powerful Muslim savant in Bauchi, the city where Ibrahim Tahir had himself grown up. Tahir had gone on to Cambridge University, earned a doctorate in social anthropology there, when in late colonial, early post-colonial times, Cambridge stood out as a center of West African anthropology. Then he returned to Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, the first Northern Nigerian university. He became a major figure there in academic politics, and apparently did not have time for much more research. But he did find time to do a novel showing both the local power structure and how young pupils of more itinerant Muslim preachers can become a conspicuous and sometimes dangerous part of the street population, something showing up again and again in the upheavals of Nigerian history. I devote a chapter to fiction about the late 1960s Biafra War, when the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria tried to secede and form their own republic. The most famous of the novels coming out of that is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's debut book, Half of a Yellow Sun, of 2007. The title alludes to the design of the Biafran flag. The book became a great success, but one might note that Adichie himself, or Adichie herself, was born long after the war, so it draws on her readings as well as on her parents' memories. Among those who could rely more on their own experiences of the war period was again Cyprian Ekwensi, whose Divided We Stand came out in 1980, but was said to have been written more than a decade earlier in the heat of battle. And there was also a short novel by Florent Nwapa named Never Again from 1975. Nwapa had already had another novel published, thereby becoming the first internationally published Nigerian woman novelist. In a large latter portion of my book, I then turn to that Afropolitan theme of Nigerians moving about in a wider world. In the colonial era, there had already been those young Nigerian men who had been made to serve far away as soldiers as the British Empire fought Japan in Southeast Asia in World War II. There is a novel about them, Burma Boy, by B.A. Bandele from 2007. Bandele's father had been a Burma boy himself, so Bandele could draw in part on family memories. But I also discovered that Bandele was born in Kafanchan in 1967. So when I was there in the 1970s, he may have been among the boys I would encounter in the town streets. Then in the late colonial and early post-colonial period, there were the Bintus, the term in the popular vocabulary of Nigerian English. I encountered it in conversations I had in Kafanchan. A Bintu was somebody who had been overseas, most often to Britain, for so long the colonial power, and had returned with some likelihood of earning prosperity and influence. And the Bintus appear in Nigerian fiction as well. There is one as a key figure in one of Chinua Achebe's later novels, No Longer at Ease, from 1960. But this young man's life turns into a tragedy, not unusual in writings on this theme, as the Bintus become marginal men, struggling with the conflicts between modernity and tradition. I'm moving to the later chapters of my book, to those Afropolitan stories based in the United States, some non-fiction and social commentary, some fiction. Early on, there was John Pepper Clark's America, Their America from 1964. A youthful academic stipendiate, Clark dwells in large part on how little Americans know about Africa and what strange ideas they have about it. Obviously, he doesn't mind pointing this out to them and comes across as pretty arrogant. He overhears a comment about himself. Of course, the young man may be a genius, but how can I possibly ask friends over to meet him when he shows such a penchant for making enemies? Soon enough, Pepper Clark's hosts are happy to see him return to Nigeria. Okay, Ndibe, on the other hand, comes to remain, writing several books, both cultural commentary and fiction, about complicated traffic back and forth between Igboland and New York. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Teju Cole, the most renowned of recent Afropolitan writers, also combine fiction and social commentary. Adichie's major novel, Americana, is a multi-side satire of a Nigerian couple's experiences, divided between the United States and Great Britain, and then finally reunited in Nigeria. Then, in the final chapter of Afropolitan Horizons, I turn around to have a quick look at expressions of African American interest in Africa generally, and what is now Nigeria especially. Mostly this final chapter is not so much about fiction, but about two Black communities in the southeastern United States. One is in those coastal wetlands, which have been the home of the people known as Gola or Geechee. In the days of slavery, plantation owners here became more or less absentee landlords, and so the slaves, turning into ex-slaves and descendants of slaves, had an unusual degree of cultural autonomy. By the 1930s, a Black linguist, Lorenzo Dowd Turner, took it upon himself to do a study of the Gola dialect and found that it was not just bad English, but could be described as a Creole language. It took some time to get his monograph, Africanisms in the Gola dialect, published by a reputable university press. But with time, it became a classic. Meanwhile, pursuing his interest in African and African-influenced language forms, Turner made his way to both Brazil and Nigeria. That other African-American community in southeastern United States, which I focus on, is in South Carolina, just a little north of the old harbor town of Beaufort, and named Oyotunji Village. I made my way there myself once for a brief visit. A roadside sign announced that you are now leaving the United States of America. Beyond that sign was something indeed looking rather like a contemporary southern Nigerian town. The story of Oyotunji Village begins with Walter Eugene King, born in Detroit in 1928, taking an interest in African culture already as a teenager. He joined a local Afro-Cuban Santeria cult brought to the United States by migrants from Cuba. But King became dissatisfied as he wanted something more authentically African. He read up on what he could find of historical and anthropological sources on Yoruba religion, started a Yoruba temple, and renamed himself Adefunmi. Then in 1970, with 5 families accompanying him, Adefunmi moved from New York to South Carolina and managed to buy 10 acres of uninhabited land on which Oyotunji village was built. Adefunmi was crowned as Oba, the Yoruba kingship title. The villagers then were reinvented Yoruba, born again Yoruba. They sought contacts in Nigeria and began traveling there. In other words, here was a reverse Afropolitanism. Americans reaching out from their North American periphery to an attractive African center. By the time I made my one-day visit to Oyotunji village, however, there were no longer so many people living there. The village has had its continued ups and downs, but apparently it had become less a place to live, more a place to visit. A bit of a modest African-American theme park. And as it happened, my visit to Oyotunji village was just a few days after the 2008 American presidential election. The United States had just elected its first Black president, Barack Obama, with a Kenyan father, thus Afropolitan #1. So those days may not have been a time when most Black Americans were so inclined to give up on their country. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a beautiful talk, a lyrical talk. So it was really marvelous. One really felt oneself transported into the arena that you're talking about. Now, the way that we handle questions is that you're welcome to put them into the Q&A, which means simply you send them into the Q&A box there. But also, if you would like to speak, do put your hand up as well. We have one question already, but please do fire them in. Sirachi, would you like to ask your question live, or would you like us to read it out for you? Perhaps you could indicate. I know sometimes you prefer us to read them for you. But
so yeah, if you want to speak, read your question, just raise your hand. There's also a raised hand by Thomas Highland Erickson already.
Absolutely, yes, I see. So we'll just see. Okay, well, we've not heard from such Sirachi yet, but just to give him a chance to respond, then why don't we go straight to Thomas? That's a good idea. So it's very nice to hear from you. Go ahead then, Thomas, please.
Hello, hello, David. No, that was a mistake. I'd like to raise my question a bit later on instead. So I raised my hand by mistake. So move on to the next one.
It's the first time in 20 years I've heard you lost for words. How remarkable. Anyway, I am now speechless. Absolutely. Okay, well, let's go to Sirachi's question then. He says, thank you for your remarks. And he asks our speaker, how do global literary trends inform and reflect the Nigerian experience? Do local global novels, such as The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, excite and infuse into the Nigerian literati? What new trends are emerging in contemporary Nigerian literature that ought to be noted? Thank you very much for your time. What an excellent question, but I leave it to you.
Am I supposed to answer now?
Yes, please, if you feel so inclined.
Well, that's a very big, wide question. Not quite sure where to begin with it. Well, of course, what doesn't go into my Afropolitan Horizons book so much is the way that this also Well, my Nigerian fieldwork was very much the beginning of my interest in what should we call it, in a global ecumene, the way that cultures in the world become increasingly connected to each other in complicated ways. It was also a time, you know, when I was doing this in the 1960s, 70s, when globalization and cultural imperialism were terms that both indicated that, well, with more interconnections, the world would become just more uniform, and so many non-Western cultures would simply die out, disappear, and so on. And that was not what I was seeing in Kafanchan. And so I caught on to other sort of key terms. One of them was a global ecumene, which was something I got from classic American anthropology, and Alfred Kroeber, who started taking up this ancient Greek term. And so I played with that here and there. And also, it showed up a little bit in my comment on Tutuola. I think the notion of creolization, which on the one hand suggests that there are the center-periphery relationships with the center, of course, very likely by the late 20th century in Western Europe and North America, but where there is still a lot of cultural creativity going on along the cultural continuum. And so the center might be in London or New York, but there are points in between, like Lagos, and then somewhere further out Kafanchan, and then at the end of that Creole continuum, there would be the notion of bush, which was a somewhat derogatory term, but still with a bit of sort of nice nostalgia involved in, you know, those were the good, happy, innocent days, sort of. So what hasn't gone into my literary anthropology here so much is the way that my field experience in Kafanchan really turned my anthropological thinking in particular directions.
Yes, and that, I mean, that's very interesting, because the whole question of whether or not we're writing literature has been one that has really been part of the discipline for a long time, but I don't think it's resolved yet, because even if you look at our pioneers of social anthropology, I think it's quite clear that Malinowski felt he was writing literature. You didn't think he was writing ethnography, as it were, but he was writing as somebody he hoped would be bought by the intelligent man in the street, almost as a piece of travel writing. And yet Westermarck, his teacher, wasn't. Westermarck was writing in the most dry style, which you would really have to work very hard indeed to get through. And you might read it as a young sort of anarchist intellectual or something, but you wouldn't read it as a piece of literature. That wasn't the point behind it at all. So, I mean, how do you see your own excursions in fitting into these broad two, as it were, approaches to writing anthropology?
Yeah, well, there's so many interesting questions involved here. With regard to Westermarck, well, of course, there is the fact that Westermarck, well, he spent a lot of time in Morocco, and he was at the London School of Economics, but then, of course, he was also in Helsinki, and the sort of a Nordic neighbor of ours, sort of. What I've been thinking about also is how little influence this Westermarck school in Helsinki actually had on its contemporaries in Swedish anthropology, which were not fieldwork oriented to any great extent, and just simply didn't seem to pay much attention to Westermarck and Karsten and all these people. Then if you look at Malinowski, well, my stream of consciousness now takes me to Malinowski's field diaries, which of course became very controversial when they were published. And here again, I mean, I wonder to what extent this is autoethnography in the stuff for publication. Malinowski had to be sort of objective and discuss the Trobrianders and the Kula ring and all this. But then, of course, he also had these frustrations of field work, which would tend to be there. And I think he might have had these field diaries in a way where he really, you know, took out all these and exaggerated and got this out of him, sort of, and one should understand perhaps these diaries a bit also as a sort of an autoethnography, which people at that time, when they were published, were not inclined to accept as a particular autoethnographic mode of writing.
Yes, yes. But what about the early anthropologists writing about Africa, though? Would you think that Evans Pritchard would have called his work literature? I kind of think he would. I mean, I think they're self-consciously writing in a humanity style. I don't know whether you think that as well.
I think, you know, okay, so that's not so current on my mind. So I could just basically agree with you that I think as a fieldwork pioneer, also again functioning in a colonial setting, he was actually dealing with situations without making every detail of that so explicit in his writing. I mean, okay, so the tendency is for him to write as if the colonial setting was not there. This kind of ethnographic present that would exclude these the white faces and helmets and so on. But then in one of the two classic monographs, now I don't quite remember which one, there is a photograph which shows him sitting in the group, which seems to me to be extremely colonially organized, sort of, and says something about the story he was not telling.
Yes, yes, thank you. That helps me to understand much more clearly. Now then, any questions from our attendees for our speaker?
I see a message from my friend Bunmi Matori from Durham, North Carolina, who is herself a Yoruba Afropolitan. It was very nice of her to come here. Unfortunately, I know her husband had to teach this morning in Durham, North Carolina. But anyway, very nice to have a chance to maintain that contact also. I've never met Bunmi in Nigeria, but in Stockholm and I guess in the States and various other contacts. So.
And I think Thomas has put his hand back up again. Is it still a false one, Thomas, or would you like to speak now?
No, it's not. And in fact, I just started to type it into the Q&A because I wasn't sure if you've seen it. So there are many questions I would like to discuss with you, Ulf, but there's just one I was wondering about, because who are the readers? You know, we always ask ourselves that question, don't we? Not least when it comes to African literature. To what extent have these books been read and made an impact in the Nigerian public sphere? And has there been a change? I know that we have a colleague in Uppsala who's writing about, she has a research project now on the narrative in African societies after the death of the novel. I mean, with the assumption that people in Africa simply no longer read novels. The question is, did they ever do so? And did it have a social impact?
That is a very complicated, intricate issue. The thing is, of course, first of all, mostly Nigerian fiction gets written in English. There would be some in Hausa and some in Yoruba. I don't think I come across so much in Igbo. But the thing is, you know, from the beginning, with Damus Tutuola onwards, this went to British publishers, not least Faber and Faber and some others. And critics, literary scholars, and so on quickly started asking now, what is the intended audience for these books? And the problem would also be that with European publishers, they would be published at prices which were not particularly accessible to not so affluent Nigerian readers. I think gradually the situation has probably improved so that Nigerian authors are indeed accessible to Nigerian readers, and there would be at least a couple of Nigerian publishing houses which are having an impact of their own. Then, of course, you had this Onitsha market literature, which I mentioned, which you know, were technologically very inferior, and they could be sort of handbooks, moral treatises, political pamphlets, what have you, but occasionally also some fiction. That was in large part in English, got a counterpart in Hausa later on, but I think on the whole, you know, the situation is now sort of evening out. And of course, the new digital media also play some part in this. But there are people who know a great deal more about all these complexities than I do.
Does that answer your question, Thomas? Would you like to carry anything?
Yes, I guess it does. But well, I mean, there are others who do research on the contemporary scene who have looked at the way in which a narrative seems to be shifting from the print to electronic media, so that you can subscribe to short stories on your smartphone and that sort of thing, which seems to be more affordable, and where Nigeria is, as always, at the forefront of these literary innovations in Africa.
Well, okay, so let me just say, there can be fairly endless conversations on some of these topics. I am glad that I think about a month from now, Thomas and I will be face to face and can continue this over a dinner table. Okay?
Of course. I'm very interested in this whole question, because is looking at literature almost a substitute for urban anthropology? Would that be a kind of illegitimate way to think about it? Clearly they're not the same thing, but are you kind of saying to yourself, I'll understand the urban scene and the political changes, and it will be literature that will help me do that?
There's certainly a connection, and I mean, I went to Kafanchan certainly, you know, to continue exploring urban anthropology as a field after I'd been doing my first field study in a Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. Well, that was kind of the first generation of urban anthropology. And in Kafanchan, my initial goal was, I would say, to look at Kafanchan as a whole in all its complexity instead of just some part of an urban community. So the methodology I developed and to an extent had a chance to try out in Kafanchan was very much urban anthropology, but then of course also when I ran into these writers, but also beer bar conversations about Bintus and going to concerts with high life music and the various other kinds of popular music that were emerging on the Nigerian scene. Well, that began to take me in this transnational direction at the same time. So I guess Kafanchan, involved taking in both directions. Then, of course, so much of the Nigerian literature, fiction writing, not only Cyprian Ekwensi, but a number of the other writers as well, are indeed city people and so on. There are people that I did not really have a chance to talk about now, which are also in the book, but also Afropolitan returnees, sort of a very interesting writer named Adewale Maja-Pierce, who was born in Lagos, was taken with his British mother back to Britain, came to return to write journalism for a British audience, his British home audience, about what Nigeria was like. Now it turns out that he has moved back to Lagos, but I mean, okay, so there are interesting sort of transnational careers back and forth in this. Well, don't get me started on this, it can be very long.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. So for people such as myself, how should we understand your work in, say, for example, when it's juxtaposed next to Karen Barber's? Do you see your emphasis as being slightly contrasting?
You say Karen Barber's?
Mm. Yeah.
Karen is somebody whose work I value very highly and admire. She, of course, well, I mean, she is pretty unique in the sense that here is a British anthropologist who got her PhD at the Nigerian university. And of course, she has concentrated in fairly large part on Yoruba literature and Yoruba arts and so on. And since I certainly have not mastered Yoruba, I cannot take her work as fully into account as it really would deserve, sort of. But I do think there are certainly intersections between our interests, and I think we're both quite well aware of them. Sort of.
Yes, because I'm trying to think of the intersectionality here between the colonial setting and the literature which is being produced in its transnational framework. I mean, of course, it's inconceivable to even think of it, but how would this literature have emerged if there hadn't been a colonial context? I mean, do you see colonialism as being the driver entirely of this literary production, or are there other aspects that get intertwined with it as well?
Well, it's hard to imagine what would have happened if there hadn't been the political context of colonialism here. You had, going way back, the occasional transnational African who was sort of pre-colonial in the sense. One interesting figure is Olaudah Equiano, who was taken as a slave from what became Eastern Nigeria, from Igbo land to the New World, and by now my recollection gets a bit hazy about all his books. Strikingly enough, Olaudah Equiano had two names. He was also named as Gustavus Vasa after the Swedish 16th century king. And I wonder where that came from, sort of. But you do find some people who were basically outside the colonial framework, but in quantitative terms, of course, you would have to construct an entirely alternative, imagined West African history to, well, continue imagining along such lines.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I noticed in your book you have a chapter on detective stories.
Oh yes.
For example, which is obviously a fascinating thing. I mean, how did that emerge in the Nigerian context?
Now, so I dwell on a few cases there. One of them was actually a curious detective story, which is basically among the white expatriates in Lagos, written fairly long after I think the author moved away. She was the spouse of a New York Times Lagos correspondent. Who was there fairly briefly. And so that was one case of a Lagos detective story. But then you also have others which, well, where it becomes a bit uncertain now, should we call this a detective story or is it a fantasy where interesting spirits come out of the sea and that sort of thing. So again, there would be a case of not quite fitting the genre. Cyprian Equensi also has one quite brief detective story, little more than a pamphlet actually, which is also based in Lagos. But I think I mentioned in the book, and the name now escapes me, but there is one Ghanaian detective story writer, Ghanaian American detective story writer, who has been, I think, quite successful in setting his detective stories in the Accra context.
Yes. Coming back to my original thought, you see, because surely literature is produced for all sorts of reasons, and migration would be one. The reaction to modernity would be another, because one could argue that that Dickens is a product of a brilliant imaginist coming into contact with a very, very fast developing society, which stimulates him enormously, and you come up with this extraordinary kind of rambling novels which are terribly evocative of this period. But he was, I think, without this very, very rapid modernization and the emergence of slum life in London, I don't think we would have had Dickens, for example. And I was thinking of that really in the Nigerian context. I mean, what was the kind of the broad social changes which were really stimulating these people to write in this way?
Well, you know, I mean, Nigeria is such a beautifully complicated place, and so many things can generate fiction. Now, you know, one thing that I haven't really mentioned at all is the fact that, especially around the Niger Delta, there is oil production, which has created enormous wealth in certain circles, but also a lot of crime, piracy in the Niger Delta, and that sort of thing. And that is, you know, okay, so probably I could have done another chapter in my book on that if I if I had decided to try to be comprehensive. But okay, I think you know, organized crime certainly would be a major figure. And now, of course, these days, okay, so we'll have to see what happens in this election the day after tomorrow, but northern Nigeria at present is very affected by this. I think, was it last year that there were 3,000 kidnappings in northern Nigeria? And of course, this also has to do with, as I understand it, to a degree, global warming, the way that you can't really have the kind of cattle herds in northernmost Nigeria that you used to have. And so it seems that it's some number of people of the Fulani ethnic group who now make a living by kidnapping instead. And then, of course, there is a religious angle that between pastoralists and ex-pastoralists on the one hand and peasants on the other hand. There is also the religious divide between the Muslims and the Christians, sort of. So, yeah, so many things.
Yeah, I mean, let's carry on with this because Ellen has a related question. Would you like to ask directly, Ellen, if you're there? But Ellen is just whilst we're getting up on screen. Ellen is asking what we should tell students of literature who wonder why they should read anthropology. But would you like to highlight yourself, and then we can get you live? Perhaps Ellen is no longer with us. Well, perhaps Ellen has gone, so I'll read out her question exactly. So Ellen says, what should we tell students of literature who wonder why they should read anthropology at all? And she says, I teach anthropology to students of comparative literature. So this is a real question. So Ellen would like your advice.
Well, I would think that sounds like a good idea. Well, all students should do more anthropology. It's perhaps the most, if there is any discipline that can offer sort of general knowledge of the world along many dimensions, it should be anthropology. But I would think for students sitting at their desks in London or Stockholm or Vienna or wherever and reading fiction from another continent, I would hope that their curiosity about what does this mean, sort of, would take them toward anthropology.
Oh, I see. No, Ellen says she is here, but she needs some help. Haneen, can you help her go live?
Yes, I can. I'll just allow you to speak, Ellen. And you can unmute yourself now.
Oh, hi, Helen.
Hi, Ulf.
Very good.
Well, you've already started to answer, but yes, I'm always trying to find reasons to convince students of literature to read anthropology, and very often they are interested in anthropology, particularly those who study comparative literature, but they have this a priori that it's, it comes with colonial baggage. I think your book will be an amazing teaching tool, actually.
Yeah,
But
well,
thoughts.
fortunately for us in Scandinavia, we have, I think, very little of the colonial baggage, and it's just such a pity that half century or more after the colonies became free, the empires basically ended. That British, French, Dutch, whatever, Portuguese maybe, colleagues would still have to carry that baggage around, because I'm sure that the younger generation who've studied anthropology from around 1960, 70 onwards don't really have all that much of the colonial baggage and those attitudes which possibly an early generation of colonial anthropologists could have had. And then, of course, I think it's probably true also that even anthropologists in the colonial age were not just sort of ordinary colonialists. I mentioned the case of this student of the Igbo in 1913 to 14, who was obviously already having a tough time with his district officers who felt that he was very strange. I think anthropologists might have gotten rid of much colonial baggage while the colonies were still around.
Does that help you? Does that help you with the question?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree, Ulf. But I do think there is, well, at least in the UK, a younger generation of students who see things a bit differently, and who, for example, look at who is writing about home in anthropology and who, still worry about these traces. It's not to say, of course, that anthropologists are still colonialists, but there is still this perception, perhaps because we're one of the disciplines that continue to discuss these issues. I don't know.
Let me just point out, while I still have you there, Helen, that let me hope that we can continue this conversation again at our kitchen table in that house in southern Sweden, where I have my Nigeria book sorted. We had very nice conversations there before, and we'll continue.
Sure.
Right.
Thank you, Ulf.
Well, thank you very much. And there's a question from Sirachu, who says, how does a contemporary Nigerian writer such as Ayobami Adebayo change or influence Nigerian society, especially as to the role of women?
Well, what should I say on this? Okay, so, this book was basically, I finished writing it, 2-3 years ago or something like that. Then I've had the luck in the last few months of going through major bookstores in New York and London, and I see this continuous outpouring of a new Nigerian fiction. Probably more Nigerian women writers than male writers in the last few years. And So I now have a file which I picked up so very recently, have not really had a chance to read yet. Again, quite a bit of it sort of becoming what fantasy, magical realism, whatever we shall call these. And I think it's pretty clear that while it did not have a very large part in the early decades of Nigerian literature, by now it seems to me that Nigerian or Afropolitan literature is becoming in large part a field of women writers.
Well, thank you. But can anthropologists themselves write fiction? I think this was really what was in the back of my mind when I asked my opening questions. I mean, what genre are we writing, in fact? I mean, Leach scandalized the ASA, of course, by saying all anthropology is fiction. You know, and then Laura Bohannon's work is still read, Return to Laughter. How would you fit all that in? I mean, can an anthropologist today go to Nigeria and write fiction and play a part in the very movement that you're describing, do you think?
I think, you know, as part of literary anthropology, you are beginning to see the signs of this as well. I'm sure that I have people in the audience here this afternoon who really would be better equipped to say something about this than I do. But personally, I mean, I've never really been drawn to try writing fiction, and it's just the way that my mind happens to function, I suppose. But then also perhaps because the non-fiction variety of anthropological fields is so rich, we may not be quite as drawn to going all the way to fiction as other people more constrained in their academic habits might be.
Yeah, I myself think that however one might want to encapsulate our discipline, it is in fact a different thing to write fiction. One would, I think, that most anthropologists probably couldn't do, because they're so attuned to trying to observe and to write down what they see, and they're not really listening to their internal imagination, except in as much as it helps them make sense of those things that they see. So in effect, we're kind of wandering empiricists, really. Now, any more questions for our speaker? If there are no more, please don't hesitate to ask. I see that Richard is with us. I don't know, Richard, whether you would like to ask anything. This is your chance, if you would. Just highlight yourself or send something into the chat.
Yeah, the raise hand button is under the reactions. It's a little hidden, I think, for some people. There's a in the controls at the bottom, it says reactions. And when you click on that, you can click on raise hand for anybody who would like to speak.
Well, I think then we've exhausted our audience, and we just have to thank you for really a beautifully evocative talk about a book which is equally well written. And as we've already discussed, we can't encourage people to go off and buy it because it's open access, but we can encourage people to go off and read it and to circulate it amongst their students. And if you have any comments, to write to Professor Hannerz and ask him. So it just remains for us to thank him for entertaining us so beautifully this evening, and to look forward to his next project. So thank you very much indeed.